First tonight, President Putin has warned that Russia could attack military facilities of countries that have allowed their weapons to be used against Moscow. Mr. Putin has also announced the use of a new long-range hypersonic ballistic missile targeting Ukraine. Kyiv initially thought Russia had used an intercontinental ballistic missile in the attack on the eastern city of Dnipro yesterday. But Vladimir Putin later said it was an experimental hypersonic weapon called Oreshnik. It comes after Ukraine used American and British long-range weaponry against Russia this week. Correspondents say Mr. Putin's rhetoric and testing out a new kind of missile, as well as throwing North Korean troops into the fight with Ukraine, plus making a direct threat to the West, suggests he's determined to escalate things. Well, the West insists Russia is clearly the aggressor.
Our missileman named it Oreshnik, hazelnut tree. The tests were successful. The launch target was achieved. One of the largest and most famous since the times of the Soviet Union industrial complexes which still produce missiles and other arms today was destroyed on the territory of Ukraine in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro. The development of intermediate and short-range missiles are carried out by us as a response to U.S. plans to produce and deploy intermediate and shorter-range missiles in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. We believe that the United States made a mistake by unilaterally destroying the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019 under a far-fetched pretext. On November 19, 6th U.S. made operational tactical missile systems at ATACMS, and on November 21, during a combined missile attack, the UK-made missile system Storm Shadow and US-made HIMARS hit military facilities in the Bryansk and Kursk regions of the Russian Federation. Since then, as we have repeatedly emphasized, the regional conflict in Ukraine provoked by the West has acquired elements of a global character.
Vladimir Putin there. Meanwhile, NATO says Russia's use of an experimental hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine will not change the course of the conflict. The alliance's spokeswoman, Farah Detlala, says it will not deter Ukraine's allies in NATO from supporting Kyiv. Looks pretty deadly, doesn't it? Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line from London by the European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. And just following on from that, those major developments from yesterday in Dnipro, the Russian president talking about a new sort of powerful hypersonic missile called Oreshnik, and following it up with new threats. I mean, how much is all that a clear escalation, if not in attacks, certainly in rhetoric?
It is an escalation. Of course, Moscow points out that it's only a reply. And to this extent, it's interesting they've chosen to use a medium-range missile, the exact mirror, if you like, of the medium-range missiles being used against Russia right now, the UK and American ones by Ukraine. So the fact he hasn't used an ICBM in that sense suggests a certain limited escalation, which is, I think, good news all round. The second point to note is that he has actually quite clearly stressed that he's thinking of a military base in Poland. It will be recalled that in my books, I stated that the first attacks will be on Poland. The reason being that it's a country which has successfully, often, and even when unsuccessfully, has constantly protested against Russia, and Russia sees this as one of its enemies. And therefore, if they do choose to strike a military base, it is quite clear where he's thinking. It will be there. As for the attack on Ukraine yesterday, it was in effect a test run as far as I can tell. The importance of it is that he now feels that he can target specific places, which is very important in the sense of being able to claim that he's attacking only military targets in the West and avoiding any civilian casualties. The very thing, of course, that is so difficult at present for Ukraine and Russia in their local war there to, of course, carry out. So the answer is yes, it is an escalation. I think there'll be more to come. However, of course, according to Russia, it's not an escalation, it's retaliation. So it's the familiar us versus them syndrome.
Indeed, but despite the rising rhetoric, I suppose the good news is that the new weapon was not nuclear armed, and there's no suggestion that Russia is any closer to using nuclear weapons despite the rising rhetoric.
Quite right. We're still not in phase 4, we're in phase 3. The closest we've come to it is the use of those anti-personnel landmines, which are banned by some countries. But we're still, thank goodness, in the conventional part of the war, phase 3, and not, in fact, in any nuclear ones. Moreover, please note, it was not a chemical warhead either. So from that point of view, it was a conventional arm, simply faster than any other, and so far more difficult to stop, even if it can be stopped at all.
And it's interesting that the Russians warned the Americans about the launch of this new Oreshnik missile before it happened. I mean, it clearly suggests that the Russians do still follow some kind of protocol, doesn't it?
Yes, which is very good news indeed. The last we heard was that the hotline was no longer in use. But if the Russians are going to warn the Americans, that is very important. It implies, as you say, they're not only just following a protocol, but they're well aware of the dangers of not only of over-escalation, but of being misinterpreted. This is very important. It has happened before in wars that people have misinterpreted events, and has led to an unnecessary further escalation. Here, the Russians, by giving news, have in effect made it quite clear that these strikes will not of themselves bring about a rapid, uncontrolled and unexpected and unnecessary escalation. So that is good news.
Nevertheless, all this must be quite concerning for the Ukrainian authorities. I mean, I imagine that in terms of impact on the ground, it must be bad news for Kyiv, though, I mean, we're not quite sure what damage this new Russian missile has caused.
Claimed it was very effective, but then he wouldn't he? So there's not really that much to go on. The Ukrainians themselves, on your hand, seem to say this implied this didn't cause that much damage, but then again they wouldn't they? So we're absolutely no closer. It would appear, as far as one can tell from all the reports, it was an accurate strike, but it did not fully destroy, to any extent, the facility it was aimed at. And then again, it must be remembered about missiles is they don't actually carry a very limited payload. A good bomber carries far more of a payload in terms of bombs than any missile. And that therefore one missile out of the blue like that, although of course very scary, in itself won't win the war, and it has only limited extent.
And of course, the West says it removed the restrictions on the use of missiles on Russian territory after North Korean troops were thrown into the battle. And as we examine the links between Russia and North Korea, I wonder if the Ukrainians are starting to feel the presence of North Korean troops yet as they join the front line of Russian forces. Are you hearing anything about whether they've been engaged in fighting? If so, how successful they've been, or perhaps you've heard of North Korean prisoners of war or any North Korean casualties?
Well, the first part of your question, though, is very important in its own right. It's quite true that the Americans blamed it on the appearance of the North Koreans. Of course, the Russians blamed it on something else, and this is how it goes. However, it is quite true that's the reason why Biden took that step. The second part is, yes, there is an effect already of North Koreans because Russia is now winning on two fronts. Previously, it was holding its own in the Kursk incursion area. However, it was gaining in eastern Ukraine. Now it's gaining on both fronts to the extent by which the half of the Kursk incursion zone has been taken back into Russian hands. There are reports, of course, of Koreans being wounded or killed. As for prisoners of war, I don't believe one hears these accounts, but it can't possibly be true because after Ukraine is caught and managed to capture any North Koreans, they'd be on television on display sooner than you could say Jack Robinson or, for that matter, North Korea. So it's quite clear that at present, as the Russians have stated, training, perhaps taking part in secondary operations, perhaps helping operations, but they're certainly not endangering themselves to the extent where they can be captured or killed en masse. However, they are helping the Russians. It is a step. It will mean that the Kursk incursion zone will probably be retaken, which is bad news for Ukrainian morale because it was supposed to be a war winner.
And I think you made a very good point there, Dr. Laskiewicz, when you said that if in fact there were North Korean prisoners of war, they'd most definitely be used for publicity by the side that's captured them, and we haven't seen anything like that. And in terms of what happens next, are you expecting this latest escalation to lead to anything dramatically different in what the West and Ukraine are willing and able to do?
I expect the North Koreans to take part in completely taking back the entire Kursk incursion zone, which will be a hammer blow for Ukraine, as I said, because it was supposed to be a war winner. That's step one. I expect the Russians to carry on progressing in eastern Ukraine because they simply have greater resources and there's no need for them to redeploy troops to help liberate the Kursk incursion area because the North Koreans are helping. But all that is small fry compared to the big one. Putin has seen that his medium-range missile can hit precisely the target he set out for. Whether the level of destruction was enormous or not, I think on balance it was not as big as perhaps has been made out. However, it does imply, and I have stated this, Poland. If there is a US military zone there, it is a military area, it would be a huge step for Russia to take, but they have all the propaganda already worked out in the sense that granted American and Russian missiles are being used against Russia, Putin has said he will take action. It now remains to be seen whether he will do so or not. If he does, that's a very big step, which will completely, I would say, be a game changer in the sense of, especially if he kills any Americans there.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the European Affairs Analyst. He was talking to me on the line there from London.